December 22nd, 1944. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The world is reduced to two colours, the blinding, surgical white of the snow and the bruised black of the frozen pines. Private First Class Miller lies face down in a ditch, the iron scent of frozen mud filling his nostrils. Just feet away, the rhythmic, metallic clanking of a Tiger II tank vibrates through the permafrost, rattling the teeth in his skull. His lungs burn with the effort of a shallow, silent breath. His exhales must be invisible, or they will be his last. Around him, the bodies of his squad are already stiffening, their olive-drab uniforms dusted with a light powdering of frost that mimics a shroud. A German boot crunches into the crust of snow inches from his hand. He can hear the guttural mutterings of the grenadiers as they sift through the wreckage of the American line, the occasional crack of a Luger finishing what the artillery started. To twitch is to die. To shiver is to be executed. In this moment, Miller is no longer a soldier of the 106th Infantry Division. He is a ghost, a living man masquerading as a corpse in a desperate gamble against the Reaper. It is a gamble thousands of men across every theatre of the war will be forced to make, transforming the ultimate sign of defeat into a harrowing tool of survival. By the midpoint of 1942, the romanticised notions of civilised warfare had been utterly incinerated. World War II had devolved into a conflict of industrial-scale annihilation, where the sheer volume of firepower transformed the landscape into a meat grinder. On the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army were locked in a struggle that surpassed mere territorial dispute. It was a war of ideologies and racial extermination. Here, the traditional laws of land warfare, established by the Hague and Geneva Conventions, were often treated as mere suggestions, or, more frequently, discarded entirely. In the vast, undulating wheat fields of Ukraine and the skeletal remains of Stalingrad, the concept of surrender became a secondary thought. When a unit was overrun, the choice was rarely between capture and death. It was often between immediate execution or a slow demise in a labour camp. This shift in the moral gravity of the war created a tactical vacuum. As the no-quarter policy became an unspoken reality on both sides, the infantryman's primary objective shifted from victory to raw biological survival. In the initial years of the war, the Blitzkrieg doctrine relied on speed and encirclement. Millions of men were bypassed or trapped in pockets. For those isolated behind the rapidly moving German spearheads, the realization set in that they were alone in a hostile world. The noise of 20th century combat, the screech of Stuka dive bombers, the relentless thud of 88mm flak guns, and the staccato rhythm of the MG-42 created a sensory overload that often left soldiers paralyzed. In the Pacific, the context was even more extreme. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under the Bushido Code, which dictated that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. This cultural imperative meant that a Japanese soldier was expected to fight to the last man, and conversely, they often viewed an enemy who surrendered with utter contempt. In the lightless, humid jungles of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, the Americans encountered a type of warfare that was intimate and primal. The Japanese frequently utilized the terrain to stage dead scenes, leaving soldiers among the casualties to wait for a passing patrol. This forced the Allied forces into a state of hypervigilance. The military conditions of the early 1940s dictated that the battlefield was no longer a defined front line. It was a porous, chaotic space where the living and the dead were constantly intermingled. Artillery barrages would leave a field littered with fragments of equipment and human remains, making it impossible for an advancing force to scrutinize every body. For a soldier whose position had been compromised, the most logical camouflage was not a green uniform or a net over a helmet. It was the mimicry of the fallen. They learned that the human eye is naturally drawn to movement, to the rise and fall of a chest or the glint of an eye. By removing these markers of life, a man could effectively vanish in plain sight. As the war entered 1943, the scale of casualties meant that the presence of corpses was a mundane, daily reality for every frontline soldier. The psychological barrier to touching or inspecting a body grew higher as the war dragged on, creating a blind spot in the enemy's perception. Commanders on all sides began to notice a trend in after-action reports, men appearing out of heaps of dead to fire upon the rear of advancing columns. What began as a desperate individual instinct was slowly becoming a recognized, though terrifying, reality of the modern infantry engagement. The stage was set for a conflict where the distinction between the casualty list and the active duty roster was as thin as a heartbeat. As the conflict intensified in 1944, the strategic landscape shifted from the sweeping movements of grand armies to the grueling, localized attrition of close-quarters survival. The build-up to major operations like Operation Overlord in the west and Operation Bagration in the east forced millions of young men into high-density killing zones where traditional cover was non-existent. In the hedgerows of Normandy, known as the bocage, and the bombed-out shells of German cities, the physical space between opposing forces shrank to a matter of yards. In these claustrophobic environments, the strategic concern for a soldier was no longer the capture of a distant city, but the navigation of the next 30 feet of mud or rubble. The major forces involved, the US Army, the British, the Soviets, and the Axis powers, all faced a similar crisis: the saturation of the battlefield with high explosive ordnance. This constant shelling created a landscape of the dead, a surreal environment where the sheer volume of debris and bodies provided a gruesome form of tactical concealment. For a soldier trapped in a failed charge or a broken defensive line, the choice to play dead was often the only strategic move left. It was a reaction to the industrialization of death. When the enemy has enough ammunition to rake every inch of a field, the only way to avoid being a target is to appear already struck. This tactical reality was further complicated by the breakdown of communication. In the chaos of a breakthrough, units were frequently cut off and blinded. Radio operators were often the first targeted, leaving individual squads isolated without orders. In this vacuum of leadership, the instinct for self-preservation took on a communal form. Men would see their comrades fall, and realizing that retreat was impossible and surrender was a death sentence, would collapse among them. They were betting on the psychological fatigue of the enemy. An advancing soldier, driven by the adrenaline of the charge and the fear of hidden snipers, is looking for threats, for the muzzle flash, the shifting limb, or the shouting officer. He is rarely looking for the subtle pulse in the neck of a man lying in a blood-soaked trench. Furthermore, the technological advancement of the war played a silent role in this deception. The introduction of smoke screens, white phosphorus, and the heavy dust kicked up by mechanized columns provided a visual haze that favored the living ghost. In the Pacific, the Japanese perfected this into a grim art form. They understood that the American GIs, despite their superior firepower, were often psychologically unprepared for the corpse that kills. By integrating feigned death into their defensive doctrine, the Japanese forces created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia. Every clearing filled with fallen soldiers became a potential minefield of playing possum, where a single movement could trigger a grenade or a bayonet thrust from a man previously thought to be a casualty. By the time the Allies reached the borders of the Reich and the inner defences of the Japanese home islands, the strategic stakes had reached their zenith. The desperation of the defending forces meant that no trick was too low and no deception too macabre. The angles of this survival tactic were not merely about cowardice or bravery. They were about the brutal ingenuity of the human mind when pushed to the absolute edge of existence. This environment of total war did not just change how men lived, it changed how they pretended to die, turning the silence of the morgue into a weapon of the infantry. To understand the act of playing dead, one must first look at it through the lens of tactical choice. In the Pacific Theatre, feigning death was not merely a desperate accident, it was often a calculated, lethal maneuver. For the Imperial Japanese soldier, entrenched in the jagged volcanic caves of Iwo Jima or the rotting jungles of Peleliu, the corpse was a functional extension of their defensive line. US Marine records from 1944 frequently describe the playing possum tactic as a precursor to a suicide strike. A Japanese soldier would lie among his fallen comrades, often clutching a Type 97 hand grenade with the pin already pulled, held down only by the weight of his own body. As an American patrol passed, or as a medic leaned in to provide aid, the soldier would simply roll over. The resulting blast was a final act of defiance that turned the traditional sanctity of the fallen into a trap. This created a tactical environment where Allied soldiers felt compelled to dead-check every body with a bayonet or a burst of submachine gun fire, a practice that further brutalized the nature of the war. Beyond the calculated trap lies the survival instinct and the physiology of the freeze. While some chose to play dead, many others were forced into it by their own biology. Modern combat psychology identifies the freeze response as a primal evolutionary defense, known as tonic immobility. On the Eastern Front, during the massive Soviet counteroffensives of 1943, thousands of young, inexperienced German recruits found themselves pinned by the sky under the weight of Stalin's organ rocket launchers. When the barrage lifted and the Red Army infantry swarmed the trenches, many soldiers did not flee or fight. Their nervous systems simply shut down. They collapsed into a catatonic state, their hearts slowing, their skin turning a waxy pale hue that mimicked the onset of rigor mortis. In this state, they weren't acting. They were biologically indistinguishable from the dead to a hurried observer. Those who survived often recounted a detached feeling, watching the boots of enemy soldiers pass their eyes as if through a veil, their bodies refusing to move even as their minds screamed in terror. There is also the moral ambiguity of deception. In the European theatre, playing dead was often viewed through a complex moral prism. For an American or British soldier, the act occupied a grey area between cowardice and battle smarts. In the chaotic aftermath of the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, playing dead was the only reason any witnesses survived to tell the tale. When SS troopers opened fire on a field of surrendered US prisoners, those who weren't killed in the initial volley fell and remained motionless for hours. They listened as the Germans walked among them, joking and delivering mercy shots to anyone who groaned. Here, the act of playing possum was a communal pact of silence. To breathe was to betray not just yourself, but the man lying inches away from you. The morality of the act was stripped away, replaced by a singular, cold imperative. The truth of what happened here must survive, and therefore, the witness must remain a corpse. As the tactic of feigning death became more prevalent, it triggered a horrific evolution in battlefield behavior. Soldiers on all sides developed a systemic distrust of the fallen. This led to the grim practice of dead checking, the routine mutilation or shooting of corpses to ensure they remained so. In the ruins of Monte Cassino, paratroopers were known to fire a single round into the torso of every slumped figure they encountered. This wasn't necessarily born of cruelty, but of a chilling tactical necessity. The fear of a resurrection attack from the rear was so pervasive that it overrode the traditional respect for the dead. This cycle of deception and confirmation stripped away the last vestiges of humanity from the infantryman's experience. The battlefield became a place where even a man's final rest was not sacred, as the living were forced to treat every body as a potential combatant. The sheer scale of industrial noise and visual debris in World War II provided a unique technological cover for those playing dead. In previous wars, the smoke of black powder would clear, leaving a relatively quiet field. In the 1940s, the constant roar of idling tank engines, the hiss of punctured radiators, and the pervasive smell of diesel and cordite provided a sensory mask. A soldier lying still in a crater didn't just have to worry about being seen, he was hidden by the mechanical chaos. At the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, Soviet infantrymen often lay flat in the tall grass or shallow foxholes as German panzers rolled directly over them. The vibrating earth and the deafening clatter of tracks made it impossible for the tank crews to hear the gasps of the men below. The very machines designed to find and destroy life inadvertently created a cacophony that allowed the dead to hide in plain sight. For the soldiers who successfully played dead, the experience was a profound psychological crossing. They had occupied a liminal space, technically alive, but socially and tactically dead. This created a unique form of survivor's perspective that often resulted in high-value intelligence or devastating counter-ambushes. At the Battle of Peleliu, US Marines who had been bypassed by Japanese forces after feigning death were able to observe enemy positions, troop movements, and officer locations from a perspective no scout could ever achieve. When they finally returned to life under the cover of darkness, they brought with them a map of the enemy's internal organs. This transition from a motionless object to a lethal observer turned the act of playing dead into one of the most effective, albeit traumatizing, forms of reconnaissance in the history of modern warfare. This shift from passive survival to active intelligence leads us directly into the heart, the conflict's most decisive moments. The tension of playing dead reached its absolute breaking point during the winter of 1944, specifically during the Battle of the Bulge. By December 17th, the American line at the Schnee Eifel had been shattered by the sudden, massive German counteroffensive. In the confused, swirling fog and snow, thousands of soldiers from the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions were cut off, surrounded by the elite spearheads of the 1st SS Panzer Division. This was not a structured battle of maneuver. It was a desperate scramble for survival in a frozen wasteland. As the German Kampfgruppe Piper pushed toward the Meuse River, they encountered pockets of American resistance that were quickly overwhelmed. In several documented instances, US units having run out of ammunition and facing the barrels of King Tiger tanks were forced into the ultimate gamble. Near the village of Honsfeld, a group of American GIs found themselves trapped in a shallow drainage ditch as German grenadiers swept the area. With no cover but the bodies of their fallen comrades and the deepening snow, the order was whispered down the line: "Stay down. Don't breathe." The tension in these moments was agonizingly high. The soldiers had to contend with the shiver reflex, a biological necessity in sub-zero temperatures that could betray them in a heartbeat. They lay for hours, their muscles cramping, their toes turning black with frostbite, while German units established temporary command posts just meters away. Every sound was magnified. The clink of a mess kit, the strike of a match, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the mercy shots delivered to any American who showed signs of life. For the men in the ditch, time lost all meaning. They were suspended in a terrifying state of living death, where the slightest twitch or a visible puff of breath would result in a burst from an MP40. This was the climax of the survival instinct. It was no longer about the war effort. It was a singular, microscopic battle between the human will and the freezing environment. The German soldiers, pressured by a strict timetable to reach the Meuse, were hurried. They performed cursory dead checks, often kicking bodies or prodding them with bayonets to see if they flinched. One survivor later recounted the sensation of a German soldier standing on his lower back to get a better view of the road, the weight of the man and his gear threatening to crush his ribs, yet he remained as still as the frozen earth beneath him. The stakes were absolute. The ghosts in the snow were the only witnesses to the German advance, and their survival depended on their ability to remain inanimate objects in a landscape of slaughter. The turning point for these living ghosts occurred as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Ardennes. The German columns, confident they had sanitized the area, began to move their heavy armor forward, leaving only a skeleton crew of rearguard sentries. In the ditch near Honsfeld, the transition from prey to predator was silent and terrifying. As the mechanical roar of the panzers faded into a low rumble in the distance, the corpses in the snow began to stir. It was a slow, agonizing resurrection. Muscles that had been locked in tonic immobility for hours screamed as blood flow returned to frozen limbs. This was the moment of the decisive breakthrough. The men who had played dead were now behind the German spearhead. They possessed the most critical asset in warfare: total surprise. In a coordinated, ghostly surge, the survivors rose from the frozen mud. Using combat knives and the few remaining rounds in their M1 Garands, they neutralized the unsuspecting German sentries who had been smoking and warming their hands just feet away. This was not a cinematic charge with shouting and bugles. It was a series of quick, brutal, and silent executions. By dying and returning to life, these men had effectively bypassed the most formidable defensive screen in the German army. The impact of these resurrected units was disproportionate to their size. They were able to cut communication wires, sabotage fuel trucks, and most importantly, provide exact coordinates for Allied artillery via hidden radios. The German command was baffled. Reports began filtering back to Kampfgruppe Piper of ghost units operating in their rear, attacking supply lines that were supposed to be secure. The psychological shock was profound. German soldiers began to fear the very ground they had just conquered, wondering if every heap of olive-drab wool in the snow contained a man waiting for nightfall. This localized success in the Ardennes mirrored similar, larger-scale events in the Pacific. On the islands of Saipan and Tinian, Japanese possum tactics reached such a fever pitch that they forced the US Marines to change their entire method of advancement. The climax of this struggle wasn't just a physical battle, it was a collapse of the traditional rules of engagement. When the dead began to fight back, the very foundation of battlefield certainty crumbled. The decisive breakthrough wasn't just a tactical gain of territory, it was the realization that in total war, the only way to truly defeat an enemy was to ensure they were dead beyond any shadow of doubt. This harrowing realization shifted the momentum of the conflict, leading directly into the grim accounting of the aftermath. The silence that followed these engagements was often more haunting than the noise of the battle itself. When the smoke cleared over the Ardennes, or the tropical sun rose over the blood-stained sands of the Pacific, the true cost of playing dead began to be tallied. For those who survived by mimicry, the physical toll was immediate. Hundreds of men were recovered from the snow with grade 4 frostbite. Many lost toes or entire feet because they had prioritized immobility over the biological need for warmth. In the Pacific, men who had hidden under the bodies of their comrades for days were frequently found in a state of severe dehydration and septic shock, having absorbed the fluids of the decomposing remains around them. The strategic consequences were equally grim. The prevalence of these tactics led to a hardening of the infantry's heart. Combat reports from early 1945 show a marked increase in what was euphemistically called battlefield sanitation. A US Army after-action report from the Rhineland campaign noted that the troops had developed a deep-seated distrust of all enemy casualties. It had become standard practice to fire into any body that had not been clearly mangled by high explosives. This was the strategic residue of the ghosts of world, where the wounded were often finished off because the risk of them being possums was too high to ignore. Psychologically, the consequences were devastating. Survivors of these death mimicry episodes often suffered from a specific, intense form of post-traumatic stress disorder. They had lived in a state of suspended animation, often watching their friends be mutilated while they remained motionless. One veteran, Sergeant Eugene Sledge, noted in his memoirs the soul-shattering experience of seeing men reduced to objects. To play dead is to deny one's own humanity, to suppress every instinct to cough, to blink, to scream in favour of a cold, reptilian stillness. When these men returned to their lines, they often brought a 1,000-yard stare that was different from other soldiers. It was the look of someone who had already crossed the sticks and crawled back. The casualty lists of World War II are filled with names that should have been in the killed in action column, but were instead moved to survived. However, the records also reflect the tragic false positives of this tactic. Many soldiers who were truly wounded and unable to move were mistaken for possums and killed by enemy troops who were no longer willing to take chances. The act of playing dead had effectively turned the battlefield into a place where a cry for help was often answered with a bullet. The broader consequences of these ghost tactics rippled far beyond the immediate trauma of the survivors, fundamentally altering military doctrine and the very technology of infantry equipment. By the closing months of the war, the major powers realized that the traditional search and rescue, or corpse recovery protocols, were woefully inadequate for a battlefield where the dead could be booby-trapped or breathing. This led to a shift in infantry training. Soldiers were no longer taught just to clear a trench, but to sanitize a zone with systemic, cold efficiency. This dehumanization of the casualty became a permanent scar on 20th century warfare, influencing how future conflicts in Korea and Vietnam would be fought, where the distinction between a non-combatant, a corpse, and a threat remained dangerously blurred. In the realm of technology, the prevalence of playing dead accelerated the development of more sophisticated detection and clearing tools. The Allied forces began to rely more heavily on flamethrowers and white phosphorus grenades, not just to clear bunkers, but to ensure that a field of bodies stayed dead. In the Pacific, the flamethrower became a grim necessity for burning out the dead to prevent nighttime infiltration. Simultaneously, medical triage evolved. Medics were trained to look for subtle signs of shock-induced catatonia versus actual death, leading to more rapid evacuation techniques that aimed to get the living ghosts off the field before they were finished off by a wary enemy. Diplomatically, the accounts of men playing dead and the subsequent dead-checking by opposing forces fueled a series of post-war investigations into war crimes. The testimonies of those who survived the Malmedy massacre by lying among the dead were instrumental in the 1946 Dachau trials. For the first time, the omitted action of a soldier, staying still while a crime was committed, became the most powerful evidence in a court of law. These men, who had been invisible to the SS, became the very voices that would hang them. The act of feigning death had transitioned from a survival instinct to a historical safeguard, ensuring that the truth of the war's most brutal moments was not buried with the victims. As the war finally ground to a halt in 1945, the soldiers who had utilised this tactic returned home to a world that could not possibly understand their experience. They had mastered the art of non-existence, of becoming a part of the landscape to avoid the machinery of death. This legacy of the living corpse remained a hidden chapter of the conflict, a testament to a level of psychological endurance that pushed the human spirit to its absolute, horrifying limit. It was a transition from the physical reality of the foxhole to the philosophical depths of the human condition, leading to a final reflection on what it means to survive. To play dead is to engage in the ultimate act of submission in the hope of the ultimate reward, another minute of life. In the vast, industrialized carnage of World War II, where men were often reduced to mere statistics by the sheer volume of steel and fire, the ghost's gamble represents the final, irreducible rebellion of the individual. It was a rejection of the war's logic. If the machine demanded a body, the soldier would provide one, but it would be a lie. This tactic reveals a haunting truth about the nature of human survival. It suggests that under enough pressure, the line between life and death is not a wall, but a veil that can be stepped behind. The men who lay in the snows of the Ardennes or the mud of the Pacific were forced to conquer the most basic of human impulses: the urge to scream, the need to move, and the reflex to protect oneself. In doing so, they reached a state of discipline that is almost incomprehensible to the civilian mind. They became statues in a garden of horrors, proving that the mind can command the body to mimic its own end to ensure its continuation. Ultimately, the stories of those who played possum remind us that war is not just a series of maps, calibers, and grand strategies. It is a deeply intimate struggle fought in the silence of a held breath. It tells us that even when the world is being torn apart by the roar of engines and the crash of artillery, the most powerful weapon a soldier might possess is not a rifle or a grenade, but the cold, terrifying stillness of a man who refuses to die, even when he looks the part perfectly. These living ghosts are a testament to the primal will, a force that persists even when the light of humanity seems to have been completely extinguished.